There are moments in history that define generations, moments so seared into collective memory that they become synonymous with the very concept of surprise, catastrophe, and awakening. For Americans, December 7th, 1941 is one such moment, a date which will live in infamy, as President Roosevelt declared. Pearl Harbor was the strike that pulled a reluctant nation into global war, unified a divided country, and set in motion the chain of events that would shape the entire 20th century. But what if that strike never landed? What if American intelligence had pieced together the warnings in time? What if the Japanese attack fleet had been detected and turned back? What if December 7th, 1941 passed as just another quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, leaving America to sleep through what might have been its awakening? This is the story of the attack that never came, a story of a warning heeded, a disaster averted, and a nation that remained asleep while the world burned. This is the story of how preventing one catastrophe created another, longer, more insidious tragedy. The tragedy of a country that never learned to see beyond its own shores until it was far too late. To understand what didn't happen, we must first understand what did happen in our reality. In the months before December 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan had reached a breaking point. Japan's imperial expansion into China and Southeast Asia threatened American interests in Western colonial holdings. The U.S. had responded with economic sanctions, cutting off oil exports to Japan, a move that essentially put a timer on Japanese military capability. Without American oil, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. Japanese military planners faced an impossible choice: withdraw from their conquests and accept humiliation, or strike at American power in the Pacific before their fuel reserves ran dry. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had studied at Harvard and knew America's industrial potential. He understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States, but he believed that a devastating surprise attack might buy Japan enough time to consolidate its empire and force America to accept a negotiated peace. The plan was audacious: sail a carrier strike force across 3,500 miles of ocean in radio silence, launch a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and destroy America's naval power in a single morning. If successful, it would give Japan free rein in the Pacific for at least a year, perhaps longer. The attack was scheduled for Sunday, December 7th, when most of the American fleet would be in port and most personnel would be ashore or sleeping off Saturday night. In our timeline, the attack succeeded beyond Japan's wildest expectations. All 8 battleships in harbor were damaged or sunk. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans died. The strike unified American public opinion overnight, transforming an isolationist nation into an avenging juggernaut. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a rallying cry. Within 4 years, American forces would island hop across the Pacific, firebomb Japanese cities, and ultimately deploy atomic weapons that forced Japan's surrender. But in the alternate timeline we're exploring, none of this happened. The critical divergence point came in the early morning hours of December 7th, 3 hours before the attack was scheduled to begin. In our timeline, 2 Army radar operators at Opana Point detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at 7:02 a.m. They reported the contact to their superiors, but the watch officer dismissed it as an expected flight of B-17 bombers due to arrive from California. He said, "Don't worry about it." Those 4 words allowed 183 Japanese aircraft to approach unmolested and catch the base completely by surprise. In the alternate timeline, the watch officer made a different decision. Perhaps he was more cautious. Perhaps he had read the intelligence warnings more carefully. Perhaps he had simply slept better and was thinking more clearly. Whatever the reason, he ordered a full alert. At 7:15 a.m., air raid sirens began wailing across Oahu. Fighter aircraft scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries manned their guns. The Pacific Fleet went to battle stations. When the Japanese strike force arrived at 7:55 a.m., they found not a sleeping target, but an aroused defense. American fighters were airborne and climbing. Ships had cast off moorings and were maneuvering in the harbor. Gunners were tracking the skies. The surprise was gone. The aerial battle that followed was brief but intense. American pilots, though outnumbered, had altitude advantage and warning.
Japanese aircraft, expecting no opposition, found themselves immediately engaged. Some bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, hangars were damaged, a few ships were hit, but none of the catastrophic damage of our timeline occurred. No battleships sank, no ammunition magazines exploded. After 20 minutes of confused combat, the Japanese force commander made the painful decision to break off the attack and return to the carriers.
To understand what didn't happen, we must first understand what did happen in our reality. In the months before December 1941, tensions between the United States and Japan had reached a breaking point. Japan's imperial expansion into China and Southeast Asia threatened American interests and Western colonial holdings. The U.S. had responded with economic sanctions, cutting off oil exports to Japan, a move that essentially put a timer on Japanese military capability. Without American oil, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. Japanese military planners faced an impossible choice: withdraw from their conquests and accept humiliation, or strike at American power in the Pacific before their fuel reserves ran dry. Admiral Izuruku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had studied at Harvard and knew America's industrial potential. He understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States, but he believed that a devastating surprise attack might buy Japan enough time to consolidate its empire and force America to accept a negotiated peace. The plan was audacious: sail a carrier strike force across 3,500 miles of ocean in radio silence, launch a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and destroy America's naval power in a single morning. If successful, it would give Japan free rein in the Pacific for at least a year, perhaps longer. The attack was scheduled for Sunday, December 7th, when most of the American fleet would be in port and most personnel would be ashore or sleeping off Saturday night. In our timeline, the attack succeeded beyond Japan's wildest expectations. All 8 battleships in harbor were damaged or sunk. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans died. The attack unified American public opinion overnight, transforming an isolationist nation into an avenging juggernaut. "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a rallying cry. Within 4 years, American forces would island hop across the Pacific, firebomb Japanese cities, and ultimately deploy atomic weapons that forced Japan's surrender. But in the alternate timeline we're exploring, none of this happened. The critical divergence point came in the early morning hours of December 7th, 3 hours before the attack was scheduled to begin. In our timeline, 2 Army radar operators at Opana Point detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at 7:02 a.m. They reported the contact to their superiors, but the watch officer dismissed it as an expected flight of B-17 bombers due to arrive from California. "Don't worry about it," he said. Those 4 words allowed 183 Japanese aircraft to approach unmolested and catch the base completely by surprise. In the alternate timeline, the watch officer made a different decision. Perhaps he was more cautious. Perhaps he had read the intelligence warnings more carefully. Perhaps he had simply slept better and was thinking more clearly. Whatever the reason, he ordered a full alert. At 7:15 a.m., air raid sirens began wailing across Oahu. Fighter aircraft scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries manned their guns. The Pacific Fleet went to battle stations. When the Japanese strike force arrived at 7:59 a.m., they found not a sleeping target, but an aroused defense. American fighters were airborne and climbing. Ships had cast off moorings and were maneuvering in the harbor. Gunners were tracking the skies. The surprise was gone. The aerial battle that followed was brief but intense. American pilots, though outnumbered, had altitude advantage and warning. Japanese aircraft, expecting no opposition, found themselves engaged immediately. Some bombs fell in Pearl Harbor, hangars were damaged, a few ships were hit, but none of the catastrophic damage of our timeline occurred. No battleship sank, no ammunition magazines exploded. After 20 minutes of confused combat, the Japanese strike force commander made the painful decision to break off the attack and return to the carriers. The second wave, scheduled to follow an hour later, was canceled. The strike force turned north and began the long journey back to Japan, leaving behind a Pearl Harbor that was battered but fundamentally intact. 3 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. 2 American fighters were lost. 14 Americans were dead. A tragedy, certainly, but not a catastrophe. Not a day that would live forever in national memory.
The immediate reaction in Washington was relief mixed with vindication. President Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8th, but his speech was very different from the one we remember. "Yesterday," he said, "the Empire of Japan attempted a treacherous attack on American forces in Hawaii. Thanks to the vigilance of our military personnel, this attack was detected and largely repelled. American casualties were minimal. The treachery of this act, however, cannot be overlooked."
Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, but now he faced a problem that hadn't existed in our timeline. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, without thousands of American dead, without burning battleships and a unified cry for vengeance, the vote was not unanimous. Isolationist congressmen argued that the attack had failed, that American defenses had proven adequate, that there was no need to enter a distant war. The declaration of war passed, but by a narrow margin and with significant opposition. More critically, the American public was divided. Yes, Japan had attacked American territory, but the attack had been stopped. Losses were minimal. To many Americans, this seemed like a problem the Navy could handle without disrupting their lives. There was no surge of volunteers overwhelming recruitment centers, no universal commitment to total war, no fundamental shift in national consciousness. The war in the Pacific that followed was tentative, half-hearted, and deeply frustrating to military planners who understood the stakes. The U.S. Navy began offensive operations cautiously. Congress authorized military spending, but not the massive mobilization that had occurred in our timeline. American industry continued producing consumer goods alongside military equipment. Rationing was limited. Bondwords were sold, but not at the fever pitch of our reality. America was technically at war, but psychologically still at peace. Meanwhile, in Europe, Nazi Germany continued its advance. By December 1941, German forces were at the gates of Moscow, besieging Leningrad and controlling virtually all of continental Europe. Britain stood alone, bloodied but unbowed, sustained by American aid under the Lend-Lease program. But without Pearl Harbor to galvanize American entry into the European War, Roosevelt faced an insurmountable obstacle. In our timeline, Hitler solved this problem for Roosevelt by declaring war on the United States on December 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, in a show of solidarity with Japan. This allowed Roosevelt to wage a two-front war with full public support. In the alternate timeline, Hitler made a different calculation. Seeing that America was already divided about the war with Japan, and knowing that public opinion strongly opposed intervention in Europe, Hitler chose not to declare war on the United States. It was perhaps the only strategically wise decision he made in the entire war. Roosevelt was trapped. He could not ask Congress for a declaration of war against Germany without some precipitating incident. Britain desperately needed American military intervention, not just supplies. Churchill sent letter after letter, each more urgent than the last, pleading for America to enter the war before Britain was starved into submission by U-boat blockade. But without the unity that Pearl Harbor had created in our timeline, Roosevelt lacked the political capital to act. The war in the Pacific dragged on through 1942 and 1943, a series of inconclusive naval engagements and slow island campaigns. Without the furious energy that Remember Pearl Harbor had unleashed, American advances were methodical but unspectacular. Japanese forces maintained control of much of their conquered territory. The brutal war of attrition that would eventually favor America's industrial superiority had not yet fully materialized because that superiority was not yet fully mobilized.
In Europe, the turning point came not with American intervention, but with Soviet endurance. The Red Army, after absorbing devastating losses, finally stopped the German advance at Moscow and Stalingrad. But these victories were Pyrrhic. Without the second front that American entry would have created, Germany could concentrate its full strength in the east. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder that consumed entire armies on both sides. Cities were destroyed. Populations were decimated. The scale of suffering exceeded even the horrors of our timeline. By 1944, the war had reached a stalemate. Germany controlled Western Europe but could not defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had stopped German advances but could not push them back significantly. Britain held on but was slowly weakening under blockade and bombing. Japan controlled the Pacific Islands and much of Southeast Asia, but American naval superiority was gradually asserting itself. And America itself remained ambivalent, fighting a war it had not fully committed to, bleeding resources into a conflict that seemed to have no end.
The political consequences in America were severe. The 1944 presidential election became a referendum on Roosevelt's war policy. His opponent, Thomas Dewey, ran on a platform of peace with honor, a proposal to negotiate settlements with both Japan and Germany that would end American involvement in foreign wars. The American people, tired of a conflict that seemed to go nowhere and cost increasingly more, elected Dewey in a landslide. The new president took office in January 1945 with a mandate to end America's wars. Negotiations began with both Japan and Germany through neutral intermediaries. The terms that emerged were bitter pills for America's allies to swallow. Japan would withdraw from the Philippines and agreed to respect American territory in exchange for America lifting economic sanctions and recognizing Japanese control of its other Pacific conquests. Germany would pledge not to interfere with Western Hemisphere affairs and allow continued British independence in exchange for America ending Lend-Lease and accepting German hegemony in Europe. Churchill called it a betrayal of civilization itself. Stalin called it the inevitable treachery of capitalism. But American public opinion supported the treaties. The wars officially ended in July 1945, ironically, almost exactly when the Pacific War ended in our timeline, but under very different circumstances. American troops came home, factories retooled for consumer production. The nation turned inward, eager to forget the frustrating conflicts it had half fought and not quite won. The world that emerged from this resolution was fundamentally different from our post-war reality. Nazi Germany remained in control of continental Europe, though the regime was showing cracks. The massive expenditure of resources on the Eastern Front had strained even Germany's ruthless efficiency. The Holocaust continued, though with less attention from the outside world. Millions died in camps and ghettos, while the world looked away, relieved to be at peace. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, maintained an uneasy border with German-controlled territory. Stalin's paranoia, always present, intensified. The purges of the late 1940s were even more severe than in our timeline. Soviet society became increasingly militarized and isolated, a besieged fortress convinced that enemies surrounded it on all sides. Japan consolidated its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a euphemism for a brutal colonial empire. Korea, Manchuria, parts of China, and Southeast Asian territories were exploited for resources and labor. The suffering of occupied populations continued with minimal international attention or opposition. Britain survived, but as a shadow of its former self. The empire began to crumble as colonies, seeing that Britain could not protect them and America would not intervene, sought independence or fell under other spheres of influence. British culture turned inward, becoming more insular and nostalgic for lost glory. The island became what it had been centuries before, a significant but not dominant power, managing its own affairs and avoiding continental entanglements. In America, the late 1940s and 1950s were marked by prosperity but also profound unease. The economy boomed with peacetime production, consumer culture flourished, suburbs expanded, television became ubiquitous. On the surface, it was the American dream realized, but beneath this prosperity lay guilt, doubt, and a nagging sense that America had failed some fundamental moral test. The veterans who returned from the incomplete wars carried different burdens than those in our timeline. They had fought, but not to victory. They had sacrificed, but not for any clear purpose. The bonds between them were strong, but tinged with the sense of having been abandoned by the nation they served. Many became vocal critics of isolationism, but their voices were marginalized in a culture that wanted to move on and forget. The intellectual and cultural life of post-war America was darker than in our timeline. Literature became more cynical. Film noir dominated cinema, reflecting national ambivalence about morality and purpose. The optimism that characterized American culture in the late 1940s and 1950s in our reality was replaced by a vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something was missing, that some great opportunity had been lost. The nuclear age arrived, but differently. The Manhattan Project continued in the alternate timeline. Scientists worked with the same urgency, driven by fear that Germany might develop atomic weapons first.
But without the immediate need to end the war with Japan, the first atomic bombs were not used in combat. Instead, America conducted a test in the Nevada desert in July 1945, just as the peace treaties were being finalized. The existence of atomic weapons complicated the post-war world profoundly. America had them first, but within years, both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany developed their own. By 1950, three powers possessed world-ending capabilities. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction emerged earlier and in a more complicated form than in our timeline. Not a two-player game between superpowers, but a three-way standoff where any conflict could trigger apocalypse. The Cold War in this timeline was colder, more frozen, more hopeless. There were no ideological competitions to win hearts and minds, no space races or Olympic rivalries, no proxy wars where the major powers tested each other's resolve. Instead, there was simply separation. Three empires glaring at each other across heavily fortified borders, each with armed weapons that could destroy civilization, each unwilling to risk using them but equally unwilling to compromise. The space age came later and with less fanfare. Without the competitive drive of the superpower rivalry, space exploration proceeded slowly, driven more by military considerations than by dreams of exploration. The moon landings that captivated the world in our timeline occurred in the alternate reality in the late 1970s, achieved by Germany, and treated more as a propaganda exercise than as a triumph of human spirit. American culture struggled with its identity. The myth of American exceptionalism, of being the city on a hill that our timeline embraced, rang hollow in a nation that had turned away from moral challenges overseas. The civil rights movement still occurred. Injustice at home demanded attention, regardless of what happened overseas, but it lacked some of the moral force that it had in our timeline. Arguments that America should lead by example lost power when everyone knew America had chosen comfort over principle.
The 1960s brought different upheavals, young people learning about the wars their parents had fought but not won, about the Holocaust that had continued while America looked away, about the empires America had accepted rather than fought, rebelled not just against authority, but against the entire moral framework of their society. The counterculture was angrier, more nihilistic, less hopeful than in our timeline. The belief that America could be redeemed, could live up to its ideals, was harder to sustain when the evidence suggested it had already failed that test.
Vietnam never happened, not because America learned lessons about intervention, but because America had never truly engaged with the first set of international challenges, so there was no momentum to engage with later ones. But other conflicts erupted in the power vacuums created by American withdrawal. Colonial wars in Africa and Asia were bloodier and longer, with no superpower interventions to limit or end them. The body counts were often higher, but occurred out of sight of American media and conscience. By the 1970s, cracks were appearing in all three major empires. Nazi Germany, having built its power on expansion and exploitation, struggled with the economic realities of trying to maintain a static empire. The ideological fervor that had sustained the regime was fading as the generation that remembered the war died off. The younger generation, more educated and more exposed to outside information through illegal channels, began questioning the fundamental premises of their society. The Soviet Union faced similar challenges. The command economy was stagnating, the costs of maintaining military parity with two nuclear rivals were crushing. The nationalities question, how to hold together a multi-ethnic empire without a unifying external threat, became increasingly urgent. Dissidents and reformers began calling for change, though the security apparatus was still strong enough to suppress most visible opposition. Japan's empire was showing strain as well. The occupied territories had never accepted Japanese rule, and resistance movements, though brutally suppressed, never entirely disappeared. The economic model of extraction and exploitation was unsustainable in the long term. Younger Japanese leaders began quietly questioning whether maintaining the empire was worth the cost. America, meanwhile, faced its own crisis of purpose. The prosperity of the post-war decades had papered over deep questions about national identity and values. But by the 1970s, these questions could no longer be ignored. What did it mean to be American if America stood for nothing beyond its own comfort? What was the purpose of power if it was never used for anything beyond self-interest?
A new generation of politicians emerged, arguing for a return to engagement with the world. They pointed to the ongoing horrors in German Europe, to the suffering in the Japanese Empire, to the lost opportunities of the past decades. But they faced entrenched opposition from those who remembered the frustrations of the 1940s wars and who feared repeating those mistakes. The breakthrough came not from politics, but from technology. The information age arrived in the 1980s, and with it came the ability to share information across borders in ways that totalitarian regimes could not entirely control. Images and stories from inside Fortress Europe began leaking out, not through official channels, but through underground networks, smuggled videos, pirate broadcasts. The world saw what had been hidden: the camps, the oppression, the systematic dehumanization. Public opinion in America began to shift. Young people in particular demanded to know why their parents and grandparents had accepted this world order. Why had America, with all its power and professed values, chosen to look away? The guilt that had been buried for decades surfaced, but now it was too late for simple solutions. The empires were too established, too powerful, too armed with nuclear weapons to be easily challenged. The 1990s brought a series of crises. In Germany, a reformist leader named Wilhelm Brandt came to power, promising to liberalize the regime while maintaining its essential structure. His reforms unleashed forces he could not control. Eastern European populations, seeing an opening, began demanding independence. The German military, divided between hardliners and reformers, teetered on the edge of civil war. In the Soviet Union, similar dynamics played out. Mikhail Gorbachev, as in this timeline as in ours, attempted reforms that the system could not accommodate without collapsing. But without the American pressure that had existed in our timeline, the collapse was slower, more chaotic, and ultimately more violent. The world stood at the edge of a precipice. Nuclear-armed empires were fragmenting. Old hatreds were resurfacing. And America, which had withdrawn from the world 50 years earlier, now faced the question of whether and how to engage with the chaos it had allowed to fester. Some argued for intervention, that America had a moral obligation to help shape the emerging order, to support democratic movements, to prevent the worst outcomes. Others argued that American intervention had failed before and would fail again, that the problems of the world were not America's to solve. The debate consumed the nation, reflecting unresolved tensions from half a century earlier.
The resolution when it came was messy and incomplete. Germany fragmented into multiple states, some democratic, some less so. The process was accompanied by violence, ethnic cleansing, and refugee crises that overwhelmed international capacity to respond. The European Union that eventually emerged was smaller and more divided than in our timeline, lacking the common history of having been rebuilt together after World War II. The Soviet Union collapsed in similar chaos, but with even less international support to manage the transition. Nuclear weapons went missing. Wars erupted in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Russia emerged as an embittered nation, convinced that the world had left it to suffer while helping others. Japan's empire dissolved more peacefully, as economic realities made maintenance impossible. But the legacy of occupation poisoned relationships in East Asia for generations. The reconciliation processes that had occurred in our timeline never fully happened here, leaving deep wounds unhealed. By the early 21st century, the world had a superficial resemblance to our own, but was fundamentally different beneath the surface. Democracy had spread, but unevenly and incompletely. Market economies dominated, but with more volatility and less international cooperation. Technology advanced, but without the unifying projects like the International Space Station that had characterized our timeline. Most significantly, the international order lacked the institutions and norms that had developed in our post-war world. There was no UN Security Council with the same authority, no NATO, no Marshall Plan legacy of international development, no shared sense that the world had collectively defeated evil and built something better. Instead, there was a patchwork of arrangements, temporary solutions, and lingering resentments. America in this alternate 21st century is wealthier than in our timeline. Decades of avoiding military spending and foreign aid compound into enormous economic advantages. But it is also more isolated, more distrusted, more uncertain of its place in the world. The American dream still exists, but it's a narrower vision, focused on individual prosperity rather than national purpose or global leadership. The moral cost of the choices made in the 1940s continues to reverberate. Holocaust memorials exist, but they carry an undertone of hypocrisy, remembering victims that the world chose not to save. Monuments to World War II veterans are more ambiguous, honoring service but unable to claim clear victory or purpose. The question, "What did they die for?" has no satisfying answer. Young Americans growing up in this world struggle with their country's legacy. They are taught about American exceptionalism, about democracy and freedom, about being a beacon to the world, but they also learn that when the stakes were highest, when evil was most manifest, America chose comfort over courage. This cognitive dissonance shapes everything from politics to personal identity. The irony is that the world would likely have been safer, more prosperous, and more just if Pearl Harbor had succeeded in our timeline as it did in the alternate timeline. The catastrophe of that attack united America, mobilized its enormous potential, and ultimately helped create the post-war order that, for all its flaws, brought unparalleled peace and prosperity to much of the world. By preventing the attack, by saving those 2,400 lives on that Sunday morning, America may have condemned millions more to longer suffering, delayed liberation, and a less stable world order. This is the deepest tragedy of the alternate timeline, that sometimes catastrophe is necessary for awakening, that sometimes suffering is the price of action, that sometimes the comfortable choice in the moment leads to greater pain in the long run. The people who detected the incoming attack, who sounded the alarm, who prevented the disaster, they were heroes in the immediate sense. They saved lives that day. They prevented ships from sinking and planes from burning. But they also, unknowingly, prevented something larger: the forging of national will, the awakening of moral purpose, the unification of a divided nation against a clear evil. History is full of such ironies. The greatest goods sometimes emerge from the worst tragedies. Pearl Harbor in our timeline was a disaster that became a catalyst. In the alternate timeline, its prevention was a victory that became a different kind of disaster, slower, less visible, but ultimately more corrosive to the human spirit. The question this alternate history poses is not primarily about military strategy or political decisions, though those matter. The deeper question is about human nature and collective awakening. How do people and nations learn to care about evils that don't directly threaten them? How is moral courage sustained without the clarity that catastrophe provides? How do we choose the difficult right over the easy wrong when the consequences of the wrong choice are distant and abstract?
In our timeline, Pearl Harbor answered these questions by forcing them. America didn't choose to wake up. It was jolted awake by explosions and fire and death. But what if the alarm clock had been turned off? What if America had been allowed to sleep through the crisis? The alternate timeline suggests that the sleep would have continued, that the awakening would have been delayed or might never have come at all, and that the cost of that sleep would have been paid by others, far away, whose suffering America would have found it convenient to ignore. This is not to argue that catastrophe is good. The 2,400 Americans who died at Pearl Harbor are not somehow less important than the larger consequences their deaths triggered. Each life lost was a universe of potential destroyed, a web of relationships torn apart, a tragedy that cannot be justified by appeals to greater goods. If there had been a way to achieve the same awakening without those deaths, it would obviously have been preferable. But history rarely offers such clean choices. The choices are usually between different kinds of tragedy, different allocations of suffering, different gambles on uncertain outcomes. The radar operators who detected the incoming attack couldn't have known the full consequences of their alert. They did what seemed obviously right in the moment, and in doing so, they may have made the world worse. As we reach the present day in the alternate timeline, the world faces many of the same challenges as our own: climate change, technological disruption, inequality, the balance between security and freedom. But it faces them with weaker international institutions, less shared history, more mutual distrust, and a superpower that spent the 20th century learning the wrong lessons. The lesson America learned in the alternate timeline was, we can avoid the costs of engagement. The lesson learned in our timeline was, we cannot escape the costs of engagement, only choose how we pay them. One lesson leads to isolation and delayed consequences, the other leads to involvement and immediate costs, but ultimately to a more stable world order. If there is hope in the alternate timeline, it lies in the human capacity for learning, however slowly. By the 21st century, new generations are questioning the choices their ancestors made. They're asking whether prosperity purchased through moral abdication was worth the price. They're wondering whether America might have a different role to play going forward. But they are also burdened by the weight of history, by the knowledge that their country chose comfort over principle at the most critical moment. Redemption is possible, but it is harder and more costly than it would have been if better choices had been made originally. The debts of history compound with interest, and the alternate timeline is still paying for decisions made in 1941 and 1945. In the end, the story of the stopped Pearl Harbor attack is a story about consequences, intended and unintended, immediate and delayed, visible and hidden. It's a story about the terrible burden of choice, about how doing the obvious right thing in the moment can lead to greater wrongs over time. It's a story about awakening and the price of sleep. Most of all, it's a story about tragedy. Not the simple tragedy of villains and heroes, but the complex tragedy of good people making reasonable choices that lead to unreasonable outcomes. The radar operators who saved Pearl Harbor were heroes. The politicians who sought to avoid war were not cowards, but leaders trying to honor their mandate to protect American lives. The public that opposed intervention was not evil, but exhausted, skeptical, and focused on problems at home. And yet, cumulatively, these reasonable choices added up to moral failure on a grand scale. This is the deepest lesson of the alternate timeline, that good intentions are not enough, that avoiding immediate tragedy does not prevent longer-term catastrophe, that sometimes the hard choice is the right choice precisely because it is hard.
We returned, finally, to that quiet Sunday morning in December 1941. In our timeline, it was shattered by explosions and death, and from that shattering came resolve. In the alternate timeline, the morning remained peaceful, and from that peace came complacency. Two paths diverged. One led through fire to a better world. The other led through comfort to a diminished one. The question for us, living in our timeline, is whether we understand how fragile the good outcomes were, how contingent on choices that could easily have gone differently. We live in a world shaped by that terrible morning at Pearl Harbor, by the resolve it created, by the sacrifices it inspired. We should neither celebrate the catastrophe nor take for granted the outcomes it produced. History teaches many lessons, but one of the most important is this: that awakening often requires a shock, that change often requires a crisis, that humanity learns most from its darkest moments. The alternate timeline, where Pearl Harbor was stopped, is a world that never fully learned these lessons, that never fully woke up, that never found the will to confront evil until it was too late to do so effectively. We should be grateful in a complex and uncomfortable way for the attack that succeeded. Not for the death and suffering it caused, those remain tragedies beyond measure, but for the awakening it triggered, for the resolve it generated, for the world it helped create. Sometimes the worst day in a nation's history becomes the foundation for its finest hour. Sometimes catastrophe is the price of consciousness. Sometimes the attack that comes is better than the one that doesn't. This is the paradox at the heart of the alternate history of Pearl Harbor, that prevention was victory, but victory became defeat, that lives saved in the moment were lives lost over decades, that the disaster averted on one Sunday morning in Hawaii became disasters uncounted across the world for generations. This is why we study alternate history, not to wish for different outcomes, but to understand how precarious the real outcomes were, and how much we owe to chance, courage, and yes, even to catastrophe
for the world we inherited.